My father, a man whose words carried the weight of a judge's gavel, once looked me dead in the eye, his face a mask of stone, and declared, "Bring back that purse or don't bother returning." He wasn't kidding, he never did. That single sentence, delivered in the stifling heat of a Georgia summer afternoon, wasn't just a command, it was a gauntlet thrown, a line drawn in the sand of our already fractured family. What he didn't know, couldn't possibly fathom, was that his ultimatum would set in motion a chain of events so explosive, so utterly life-altering, that it would unravel everything he thought he knew about me, about us, and about the true cost of loyalty. For years, I, Sarah Jenkins, had been the dutiful daughter, the quiet one who absorbed every slight, every dismissive comment, every cold shoulder from a man obsessed with appearances and control. I was the ghost in his grand, perfectly manicured southern home, a silent witness to his relentless pursuit of what he called respectability. But that day, something snapped. That purse, an antique silver mesh clutch, seemingly innocuous, became the symbol of everything he held dear and everything I despised. It was a family heirloom, yes, but to him, it represented a history of privilege he desperately clung to, a past he weaponized against anyone who dared to challenge his authority. And I, Sarah, had dared. The resentment had simmered for decades, a low, persistent burn beneath the surface of my polite compliance. Every time he'd belittled my aspirations, every time he'd dismissed my feelings as overly sensitive, every time he'd championed my brother's every whim while barely acknowledging my existence, the bitterness grew. I learned early on that in my father's world, love was conditional, earned only through unquestioning obedience. I was tired of earning. I was tired of pretending. The incident with the purse wasn't about theft, not really. It was about a hidden truth, a secret betrayal that had festered within our family for generations, slowly poisoning us from the inside out. When I stumbled upon the truth, buried deep within a stack of dusty old legal documents, it wasn't just a revelation. It was a seismic shock that shattered the carefully constructed facade of our family's history. It revealed a monstrous lie, a deception so profound it implicated not just my father, but his father before him, and the very foundation of the wealth he so proudly flaunted. The purse, you see, was merely a clue, a thread leading to a tapestry woven with deceit and injustice. What I discovered made my blood run cold. It was a story of exploitation, of a family's fortune built on the backs of others, then ruthlessly concealed through legal maneuvering and outright intimidation. The details were sickening, a stark contrast to the upright, honorable image my father meticulously cultivated. This wasn't just about a lost heirloom, it was about stolen lives, about a legacy tainted by avarice and cruelty, and my father, the man who demanded I retrieve a trinket, was deeply, irrevocably implicated. My resentment curdled into a burning obsession. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, couldn't unknow what I'd learned. The polished veneer of our family's reputation, once so intimidating, now seemed fragile, ready to crack under the slightest pressure. I became a shadow, meticulously digging, cross-referencing, piecing together the fragments of a truth that had been deliberately buried for over 70 years. Every late night spent poring over microfiche at the county archives, every hushed conversation with distant relatives who remembered whispers and rumors, only solidified my resolve. I wasn't just bringing back a purse, I was bringing back the truth, whether he liked it or not. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not in a courtroom, not in a public spectacle, but in the quiet, suffocating confines of his study, the very room where he delivered his original ultimatum. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, with the weight of decades of unspoken pain. He expected me to beg, to apologize, to return the purse, and resume my role as the compliant daughter. He had no idea I was holding the key to unlocking his entire carefully constructed world, ready to expose the rot beneath. What happened next changed everything, not just for him, but for every single person who had ever been touched by his family's dark legacy, and I was the one holding the match. My name is Alex. For 28 years, my life in this small, forgotten corner of rural Georgia had been a predictable tapestry of dusty roads, the hum of cicadas, and the oppressive weight of my father's expectations. He was a man carved from granite and stubborn pride, his word law, his gaze a judgment. I had always been his shadow, his echo, never quite my own person. That was, until the day the old leather purse went missing. It wasn't just any purse, it was my grandmother's. A worn, faded artifact from a time before I existed, filled with her last letters, a tarnished silver locket, and a single, pressed rose. To me, it was a direct line to the only person who had ever truly seen me, truly loved me without condition. To my father, it was just an object, an inconvenience, something he dismissed as sentimental junk. He had made it clear, in his booming, unyielding voice, that it had no place in his perfectly ordered, perfectly masculine world. The day it vanished, a cold dread settled in my stomach, heavier than any Georgia humidity. I searched everywhere, under the creaky floorboards of my bedroom, behind the ancient oak dresser, even in the musty attic where forgotten memories gathered dust. Each fruitless search tightened the knot of panic in my chest. That purse was more than just leather and trinkets. It was my tether to a past that offered solace, a shield against the relentless pressure of my father's dominance. Without it, I felt exposed, adrift. I remember the argument vividly. The kitchen, usually a sanctuary of simmering pots and the comforting smell of coffee, became a battleground. "It's gone, Dad." "The purse? Grandma's purse," I pleaded, my voice thin with desperation. He stood by the sink, his back to me, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary force. He didn't even turn around. "Lost things stay lost, Alex. Move on." "There's work to be done." His dismissiveness was a physical blow, a confirmation that my grief, my connection to my grandmother, meant absolutely nothing to him. Days bled into weeks, and the absence of the purse became a gaping wound. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded like a whisper, a taunt. I knew, deep in my bones, that it hadn't just disappeared. Things didn't just vanish from our isolated property. My father had a habit of tidying up, of removing anything he deemed unnecessary or, more accurately, anything that challenged his control. A chilling suspicion began to take root, a dark seed planted in the fertile ground of my resentment. The turning point came one sweltering afternoon when I overheard him on the phone. His voice, usually gruff, was laced with an unusual smugness. "Yeah, cleared out the last of the clutter. Got a good price for the lot down at the antique shop." That old purse, too. Nobody needs that kind of junk lying around. My blood ran cold. The words hit me like a physical punch, knocking the air from my lungs. He had sold it. He had taken the last tangible piece of my grandmother, my only source of comfort, and sold it for a pittance, dismissing it as clutter. A wave of nausea washed over me, followed by a searing white-hot rage. It wasn't just about the purse anymore, it was about the deliberate cruelty, the utter disregard for my feelings, for my grandmother's memory. It was about years of being told what to do, what to feel, what to be. The resentment I had carried, simmering beneath the surface, boiled over. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated act of emotional violence. He hadn't just sold an object, he had sold a part of my soul. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark, the humid air thick with unspoken anger. The image of his smirking face, the casual dismissal of my pain, replayed endlessly in my mind. He thought he had won. He thought he had asserted his dominance once again, by erasing something I cherished. But something shifted within me that night. The quiet, compliant Alex, the one who always bowed to his will, began to dissolve. In her place, a new resolve hardened. I wouldn't just mourn the purse, I would reclaim it. and in doing so, I would reclaim myself. The antique shop, Southern Charm, was a dusty labyrinth of forgotten treasures and other people's memories. I knew it well. It was the only place my father ever bothered with in town. The thought of my grandmother's purse, her most intimate belongings, being pawed over by strangers, sent a fresh wave of fury through me. I had to get it back. But more than that, I had to make my father understand the depth of his transgression. He had drawn a line, and I was about to cross it, not just for the purse, but for every slight, every dismissal, every moment he had made me feel small and insignificant. This wasn't just about a purse. This was about defiance. This was about proving to him, and to myself, that I was not just his shadow. I was Alex, and I would fight for what was mine, no matter the cost. The path ahead was unclear, fraught with the unknown, but one thing was certain: I would not return home without that purse. And if he told me not to return without it, then he would see exactly why I never would. The game had begun, and for the first time in my life I was ready to play. The first step was always the hardest, admitting to myself that the rules had changed. For years I had navigated my father's world with a quiet compliance, believing that if I just kept my head down, if I just worked hard enough, I could earn his elusive approval. That belief had shattered the moment he dismissed my grandmother's purse, the last tangible link to the only unconditional love I had ever known. His words, "Lost things stay lost, Alex. Move on," echoed in my head, a cruel mantra that solidified my resolve. This wasn't about a lost item, it was about a lost piece of myself, and I wouldn't move on until I found it, or until I understood why it was taken. My search began in earnest, but this time, it wasn't a frantic scramble. It was methodical, fueled by a cold, simmering anger. I started with the most obvious places, the places I had already checked, but with a new, scrutinizing eye. I pulled out every drawer in the old farmhouse, feeling along the bottoms for hidden compartments. I ran my hands under every piece of furniture, checking for anything stuck or wedged. The dust motes dancing in the afternoon light seemed to mock my futile efforts. Days bled into a week, each fruitless hour chipping away at my initial surge of defiance, threatening to replace it with the familiar ache of hopelessness. Yet, the memory of my father's dismissive tone, the image of his back turned to me, always pulled me back from the brink. He had thrown down a gauntlet, and I was going to pick it up. I shifted my focus from the obvious to the improbable. My father was a creature of habit, meticulous to a fault. Nothing was ever truly lost in his world. It was simply misplaced according to his own, often inscrutable, logic. I began to observe him, not as his daughter, but as an investigator. I watched where he went, what he touched, what he avoided. He had a peculiar habit of always leaving the back door unlocked, a seemingly insignificant detail in a house where everything else was secured with an almost obsessive zeal. This was unusual, especially for a man who preached vigilance. It gnawed at me, a tiny inconsistency in his otherwise rigid routine. One sweltering afternoon, while he was out tending to the fields, I found myself drawn to the old, disused shed at the back of the property. It was a place he rarely entered, filled with forgotten tools and rusted machinery. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that if the purse wasn't in the house, it had to be here. This shed was his blind spot, the place where things went to be truly forgotten, or perhaps deliberately hidden. My eyes scanned the chaotic interior, moving from the cobweb-draped shelves to the piles of burlap sacks. Then, I saw it. Tucked away behind a stack of old tires, partially obscured by a faded tarpaulin, was a small wooden chest. It was an antique, one I had never seen before, and it looked utterly out of place in the grimy shed. My hands trembled as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the rough, splintered wood. The latch was rusted shut, but with a surge of adrenaline I pried it open. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed newspapers and a few tarnished silver coins, was a single familiar object. It wasn't the purse. It was a small leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. My grandmother's handwriting, delicate and elegant, filled the first few pages. I recognized her unique way of forming her A's and L's, the way she dotted her I's with tiny hearts. My breath hitched in my throat as I read the first entry. It was a letter, addressed to my mother, written just weeks before she passed away. The words blurred through a sudden welling of tears, but one sentence stood out, stark and clear. I fear your father's anger, my dearest, for he has discovered my secret, and he believes it will ruin us all. My father had always painted my grandmother as a simple, pious woman, a gentle soul who lived for her family. This journal, this secret, shattered that carefully constructed image. What secret could she have possibly kept that would incite such fear, such anger in him? And how was this connected to the missing purse? The game had just become infinitely more complicated, and the stakes, I realized, were far higher than just a sentimental object. My father wasn't just dismissive, he was hiding something that involved my grandmother, and perhaps my entire family. The resentment I felt morphed into a burning curiosity, a desperate need to uncover the truth. I closed the journal, my fingers tracing the faded script on its cover. This wasn't just about the purse anymore. It was about understanding the man my father truly was, and the secrets he had buried. The path forward was murky, but I knew with a chilling certainty that I was no longer just searching for a lost item. I was searching for answers, and I would find them, no matter the cost. The journal became my constant companion, a fragile bridge to a past I never knew, a past my father had meticulously buried. Each entry, scrawled in my grandmother's elegant hand, chipped away at the granite facade my father presented, revealing a different man, a softer man, a man I barely recognized. He wasn't always the unyielding patriarch, the man whose every word was a command. No, there were glimpses of vulnerability, moments of tenderness described in delicate prose, a youthful exuberance that felt alien to the stern figure who now ruled our home. My grandmother wrote of his dreams, his fears, his secret desire to be an artist, a stark contrast to the rigid pragmatism he now embodied. The more I read, the more the pieces clicked into place, forming a mosaic of a life warped by unseen pressures, a life where something profoundly good had been lost. A chilling realization began to dawn on me. The purse wasn't just a symbol of my grandmother, it was a testament to the man my father could have been, the man he used to be. Its contents, the letters, the locket, the pressed rose, they weren't just sentimental junk to him, they were ghosts, reminders of a path he had abandoned, a past he had systematically erased. His rage at its presence, his insistence on its disappearance, wasn't about the object itself. It was about silencing the whispers of a different life, a life he had forsaken. The resentment that had simmered within me, a dull ache, began to sharpen into a focused, burning anger. This wasn't just about a lost heirloom. It was about a stolen history, a fractured identity, and the deliberate suppression of truth. I started to observe him with new eyes. Every gesture, every clipped word, every dismissive glance taking on a sinister new meaning. His pronouncements about tradition and order now sounded like desperate attempts to maintain control over a narrative he had painstakingly constructed. The house, once a familiar cage, transformed into a stage where a carefully orchestrated performance played out daily. I felt like an unwilling audience member, privy to a tragedy in slow motion. The betrayal wasn't just in his dismissal of my grief. It was in the years of lies, the deliberate obfuscation of who he truly was, and the denial of my grandmother's legacy. This wasn't just about a purse anymore. It was about reclaiming a narrative, a truth that had been systematically denied. One sweltering afternoon, I found myself in the old barn, a place he rarely visited. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, slicing through cracks in the weathered wood, illuminating forgotten tools and discarded farm equipment. My grandmother's journal had mentioned a hidden compartment in the barn, a place where my father, as a young man, had supposedly stashed his artistic endeavors, his secret dreams. My heart pounded with a mix of trepidation and fierce determination. If I could find it, if I could uncover tangible proof of his past, perhaps I could understand the depth of his transformation, the reason for his hardened heart. I ran my hands along the rough-hewn beams, searching, my fingers brushing against splinters and cobwebs. Then, my fingers snagged on something. A loose board, almost imperceptible against the aged timber. I tugged, and with a groan of protest it shifted, revealing a small, dark recess. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves and dust, lay a stack of yellowed canvases, small and unassuming. My breath hitched. With trembling hands I pulled them out one by one. They were paintings, vibrant and full of life, capturing the rolling hills, the ancient oak trees, the very essence of the Georgia landscape I knew so well. But these weren't just landscapes. They were infused with an emotion, a longing, a tenderness that shattered the image of the man I knew. And then, at the bottom of the stack, I found it. A small, leather-bound sketchbook. It wasn't just a sketchbook, it was filled with charcoal portraits, each one a different rendering of my grandmother. Her smile, her laugh lines, the way her hair framed her face, every detail captured with an almost painful accuracy. And on the very last page, a single unfinished sketch, a young man, undeniably my father, his eyes filled with a hope and vulnerability I had never seen. Below it, scrawled in his youthful hand, a single line, for my muse, my strength, my everything. The raw emotion of it hit me like a physical blow. This was the betrayal, not just of me, but of himself, of the love that had once defined him. The purse, the journal, the paintings. They were all threads in a tapestry of loss, a life deliberately unraveled. The anger within me solidified, hardening into a resolve. I wasn't just searching for answers anymore, I was preparing for a confrontation. The old shed, a forgotten relic at the edge of our property, had always been a place of shadows and dust, a repository for broken tools and forgotten dreams. Now it became my sanctuary, my war room. The anger that had solidified within me demanded an outlet, a plan. I spread out the contents of the purse on a grimy workbench, the faded letters, my grandmother's delicate handwriting still legible, the tarnished locket, and the single pressed rose, its petals brittle with age. Each item was a silent testament to a love my father had tried to erase. I reread the letters, every word a whisper from the past. They spoke of my grandmother's dreams, her quiet rebellions, her fierce love for her daughter, my mother. A love that transcended the rigid expectations of our small town. One letter, in particular, caught my eye, tucked away in a small hidden pocket of the purse. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a stream of consciousness, a raw outpouring of grief and regret. It described a secret, a profound loss, a choice forced upon her, one that haunted her until her dying day. The words blurred through my tears, but the meaning was stark. My father had played a part in this secret, a cruel, decisive role. A cold dread seeped into my bones, replacing the anger with a chilling certainty. This wasn't just about a missing purse or a dismissive father. It was about a hidden history, a wound that festered beneath the surface of our family's carefully constructed facade. The journal, which I had found later, spoke in veiled terms of the same secret, hinting at a truth too painful to articulate. The paintings, vibrant and full of life, were the only places where my grandmother had allowed that raw pain to surface, disguised in brushstrokes and color. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations I'd overheard as a child, hushed whispers that ceased the moment I entered a room. My mother's quiet sadness, her faraway gaze, suddenly made agonizing sense. My father's rigid control, his insistence on order, his dismissal of anything emotional. It was all a desperate attempt to bury this truth, to keep it from surfacing. He hadn't just lost the capacity for love, he had actively suppressed it, fearing what its resurgence might reveal. I knew then that I couldn't simply confront him about the purse. That was merely a symptom, a visible manifestation of a deeper rot. I had to expose the root, the secret that had twisted him into the man he was. The thought of what that might entail sent a tremor through me, but there was no turning back. The resentment had deepened into a burning obsession. I wasn't seeking revenge for myself alone. I was fighting for my grandmother's memory, for my mother's peace, for the truth that had been denied for decades. My research began subtly, methodically. I spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspaper archives, searching for anything that might connect to the vague dates and events hinted at in the letters. I spoke to elderly neighbors, feigning casual interest in local history, listening intently for any forgotten anecdotes, any slips of the tongue. Each piece of information, no matter how small, was a puzzle piece. The more I uncovered, the more the pieces started to fit, forming a picture far more disturbing than I could have imagined. The secret wasn't just personal. It had implications for our family's standing in the community, for the very foundations of the life my father had so meticulously built. He had risked everything to bury this truth, and now I was about to unearth it. The weight of this knowledge was immense, a heavy cloak that settled around my shoulders. But beneath that weight, a fierce determination burned. I wasn't just Alex, the quiet daughter. I was Alex, the keeper of secrets, the seeker of justice. The day I found the last piece of the puzzle, the missing link that connected all the disparate threads, I felt a surge of cold triumph. It was a dusty old land deed, tucked away in the county records office, a seemingly innocuous document that, in the context of everything else, screamed betrayal. It confirmed my darkest suspicions, revealing a calculated act of deception that had directly impacted my grandmother's life, and by extension, my mother's. My father hadn't just been dismissive, he had been a perpetrator. My hands trembled as I copied down the details, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the absolute, undeniable proof. The confrontation I had been preparing for was no longer just about a purse or an apology. It was about dismantling a lifetime of lies, about forcing him to face the consequences of his actions. I knew it would shatter our family, but the alternative, living with the lie, allowing his tyranny to continue, was no longer an option. The time for reckoning had arrived. The air in the living room was thick with unspoken words, a suffocating silence that pressed down on us all. My father sat opposite me, rigid on the worn armchair, his face a mask I had seen countless times, unyielding, impenetrable. Beside him, my mother wrung her hands, her eyes darting between us, a silent plea for peace I could no longer answer. The time for peace was long past, the time for truth had arrived. I held the small, tarnished locket in my palm, its cold metal a stark contrast to the heat rising within me. This, I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, was Grandma's. It was in her purse, the one you said was lost. I watched his jaw tighten, a telltale sign of his growing discomfort. He still wouldn't meet my gaze, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Alex, we've been over this, he rumbled, his voice a low growl, an attempt to assert the familiar dominance. Things go missing, it's part of life. Not this, Dad. Not this time. I leaned forward, placing the locket deliberately on the coffee table between us. And not the letters either. My mother gasped softly, a tiny sound of distress. My father finally looked at me, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Fear? Recognition? What letters? He asked, his voice suddenly devoid of its usual authority, a subtle crack in the granite facade. Grandma's letters. To me. I pulled out a small stack of aged envelopes from my pocket, each one addressed in her familiar, elegant script. The ones you told me she stopped writing because she was too sick. The ones you said she didn't have time for. I laid them beside the locket, a silent accusation. She wrote them right up until the end, Dad. Every week. His face drained of color, a stark white against the deepening flush of anger that now crept up his neck. He still said nothing, but his silence was louder than any shout. It was the silence of a man caught, a man cornered. And the money, Dad? I pressed on, my voice rising slightly, the years of suppressed anger finally finding its release. The money she left for me. For my college fund. The money you said she forgot to set aside. I pulled out a bank statement, a printed transaction history, carefully highlighted. She didn't forget, she transferred it, every last cent, to an account in my name. An account you closed, Dad. The day after her funeral. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of revelation. My mother let out a small sob, covering her mouth with her hand. My father's breath hitched, a strangled sound that was almost a gasp. He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. The mask had shattered. How did you? He stammered, his voice hoarse, completely unlike his usual booming command. The lawyer, Dad, I said, the ghost of a smile touching my lips. The one Grandma insisted I meet just in case. The one you said was just a formality. He kept copies of everything. He knew you'd try to erase her, erase me. He surged to his feet, knocking over the coffee table with a violent crash. The locket and letters scattered across the floor. You ungrateful brat, he roared, his face contorted with a rage I had never seen directed so purely at me. After everything I've done for you. Everything I've provided. Provided? I stood too, meeting his fury with a cold, unwavering gaze. You provided a cage, Dad. A life where I was never allowed to be myself. Never allowed to mourn, never allowed to remember her. You stole her from me, not once, but twice. First her life, then her memory. He lunged forward, his hand raised, but my mother, with a strength I didn't know she possessed, stepped between us. No, she cried, her voice surprisingly firm. Stop it, both of you. This is enough, he recoiled, not from her strength, but from the sheer unexpectedness of her intervention. He stood there, panting, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly. He looked at my mother, then back at me, then down at the scattered evidence on the floor. His eyes finally landed on the locket, lying open, revealing a tiny, faded picture of my grandmother, smiling. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something akin to regret, perhaps even shame. It was fleeting, gone almost as soon as it appeared, replaced by a deep, unsettling stillness. He turned slowly, his shoulders slumped, and walked out of the room without another word. The front door closed with a soft click, not a slam, but a quiet, final sound. He was gone. My mother sank back onto the armchair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I stood over the scattered mementos, the locket, the letters, the bank statement. The proof, the absolute undeniable proof. The reckoning had come. It wasn't the explosive confrontation I had envisioned, but in its quiet, devastating unraveling, it was far more effective. The truth, finally spoken, had done its work. The silence that followed was not the suffocating silence of before, but an empty, echoing void, filled with the debris of a broken family. The battle was won, but the cost was everything. The quiet, devastating unraveling had left a void, a hollow space where a family once stood. What was left was an echo, a lingering chill that no amount of Georgia sun could warm. I had stood my ground, spoken my truth, and the resulting silence was not the peace I had naively imagined. It was the sound of something irrevocably broken, shattered into a million pieces. The victory felt like ash in my mouth, the taste of isolation far stronger than any satisfaction. Days bled into weeks, each one a testament to the chasm that had opened between us. My father, once a towering figure of authority, now moved through the house like a ghost, his presence a heavy absence. He avoided my gaze, his shoulders hunched, the granite of his pride slowly eroding into something I almost recognized as regret. Almost. The house, once filled with the tension of unspoken resentments, now hummed with a different kind of quiet. The quiet of two people who had nothing left to say, nothing left to fight over. The battle had been won, but the cost was everything. One stifling afternoon, the air thick with unacknowledged grief, I found myself drawn to the attic, that forgotten space where memories gathered dust. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like an instinct, a pull towards the only other place in that house that held a piece of my grandmother. The heat was suffocating, the air stagnant, but I pushed through, my hands brushing against forgotten trunks and draped sheets. And there, tucked away in a dusty corner, beneath a moth-eaten quilt, I saw it. Not the purse, not the letters, but a small wooden box, intricately carved, its surface smooth beneath my fingertips. It was my grandmother's. I recognized the unique knot pattern on the lid, a design she had often sketched in her old journals. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden frantic rhythm. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single yellowed photograph. It was her. Younger, vibrant, laughing, her arm linked with a man I didn't recognize. And then, my gaze fell upon a small, neatly folded piece of paper beneath the photograph. It was a letter, written in my grandmother's elegant looping script. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The words blurred at first, my eyes stinging, but then they sharpened, each one a revelation. It wasn't addressed to me, it was addressed to my father. The date was years before my birth. In it, she spoke of a secret, a profound sorrow she had carried. The man in the photograph, she wrote, was her first love, a man my grandfather had driven away, accusing him of a crime he didn't commit. My grandmother had kept his memory alive, had cherished the locket in the purse not for my grandfather, but for this lost love. She confessed to my father, her son, that she had always felt a piece of her soul was missing, stolen by his father's rigid pride and baseless accusations. She had begged him, in that letter, to never let pride blind him, to never let it destroy the love in his own life. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. This was why. This was the source of my father's bitterness, his unyielding nature, his almost pathological fear of sentimentality. He hadn't just lost his mother's purse, he had lost her, in a way, to a ghost from her past, a secret she had shared with him alone. He had seen the purse not as a link to her, but as a painful reminder of her deepest sorrow, a symbol of what his own father's pride had cost her. And in his own twisted way, he had tried to protect me from that same kind of hurt, from that same kind of loss, by pushing away anything he deemed sentimental, anything that could be taken away. I walked down from the attic, the letter clutched in my hand, the photograph tucked safely inside. My father was in the kitchen, staring out the window, his back still to me. The silence was still there, but it felt different now, heavy with understanding, not just resentment. I approached him, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Dad," I began, and he flinched, turning slowly. His eyes, usually hard and unyielding, were tired, shadowed with an unspoken burden. "I found this," I said, holding out the letter and the photograph. He took them, his fingers brushing mine, a fleeting connection. As he read, his face, usually so guarded, crumbled. The lines around his mouth deepened, his jaw slackened, and for the first time, I saw him not as my unyielding father, but as a son, burdened by his mother's unspoken pain. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, meeting mine for the first time in weeks. She told me not to be like him, Alex," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. "She told me pride would destroy everything." The confession hung in the air, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm between us. It wasn't an apology for the purse, not directly, but it was an admission, a glimpse into the wounded heart of the man who had always seemed invincible. The resolution wasn't a grand reconciliation, no sudden embrace or outpouring of affection. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a shared burden. The purse was still gone, but the truth, finally revealed, had brought something else into the light. It wasn't the revenge I had sought. Not in the fiery, destructive way I had once imagined. It was something far more profound, understanding. The battle was truly won, not by destroying him, but by finally seeing him, and allowing him for the first time to see me. The cost had been everything, but the gain, a fragile, nascent connection, felt like a new beginning. The courtroom fell silent, a heavy, expectant hush settling over everyone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. Years of resentment, the bitter taste of betrayal, and the gnawing obsession for justice had all led to this single, pivotal moment. I looked at my father, sitting across the aisle, his face a mask of carefully constructed indifference, but I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. He had always been so good at hiding, at manipulating, but not today. Today, the truth would be laid bare, not just for the judge and jury, but for him. My lawyer, Sarah, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a fierce intellect, stood to deliver her closing argument. She spoke not just of legal precedents and financial discrepancies, but of a broken trust, a father's calculated cruelty, and a daughter's fight for her own identity. She painted a vivid picture of the years I'd spent trying to prove myself, only to realize I was just a pawn in his elaborate game, a means to an end. The family business he'd so proudly touted was nothing more than a front for his illicit dealings, and the purse he demanded back was just a symbol of his control, a piece of evidence he desperately needed to disappear. As she spoke, I replayed the countless conversations, the subtle manipulations, the dismissive remarks that had chipped away at my self-worth. I remembered the night he'd said, "Bring back the purse or don't return," his voice cold, devoid of any paternal warmth. At the time, I'd been devastated, feeling abandoned and unloved. Now, I understood. He wasn't just disowning me. He was trying to sever the last thread connecting me to his criminal enterprise, to silence the one person who knew too much. When it was the prosecution's turn, they laid out the irrefutable evidence, the paper trail I had meticulously gathered over months, the hidden ledgers, the coded communications. Each piece was a tiny victory, a brick in the wall of his undoing. The jury listened intently, their expressions shifting from neutrality to dawning comprehension. My father's lawyer, a slick, expensive suit with an even slicker tongue, tried to spin a narrative of a disgruntled daughter, a misunderstanding, a family feud blown out of proportion. But the facts, cold and unyielding, spoke louder than any carefully crafted lie. Then came the verdict. The foreman stood, his voice clear and resonant, delivering the words that would forever alter the course of our lives. Guilty. The word hung in the air, a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. My father's facade finally crumbled. His eyes, usually so steely, widened in disbelief, then narrowed in a mixture of fury and something akin to fear. For the first time I saw him not as the all-powerful patriarch, but as a man stripped bare, his empire collapsing around him. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Relief, yes, a profound sense of justice finally served, but also a strange hollow ache. This wasn't a triumphant moment of pure joy. It was bittersweet. I had won, but at what cost? I had sacrificed years, relationships, and a piece of my own innocence to bring him down. The man who was supposed to be my protector, my guide, was now a convicted felon, and I was the one who had put him there. Leaving the courthouse, the setting sun cast long shadows, mirroring the new landscape of my life. The obsession that had consumed me for so long was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar quiet. The fight was over. I had achieved the justice I craved, but it hadn't magically healed the wounds he'd inflicted. The road ahead was about rebuilding, not just my life, but myself. I had learned that some battles, even when won, leave scars. But those scars, I realized, were also a testament to my resilience, a reminder that I had faced the darkness and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably stronger. The purse, the symbol of his control, was now just a memory, a relic of a past I was finally ready to leave behind. I walked away, not looking back, towards a future I would define on my own terms.